The marriage certificate was dated March 15, 1842, but the ink had long since faded to the color of old blood. What hadn't faded was the secret that lived in the walls of Thornwick Manor, breathing through the cracks in the plaster, waiting in the shadows of the east wing where no servant would enter after dark. They found her diary in 1987, sealed behind a false panel in what had once been the nursery. The pages told a story that made the restoration crew stop their work and call the police, though everyone involved was 45 years dead. This is that story. The one about Eleanor Whitmore, who was 16 years old when they forced her into a carriage bound for a marriage that would destroy her mind before it destroyed her body. The one about Duke Cornelius Ashford, 65 years old, whose previous 4 wives had all died under circumstances the church found acceptable enough to allow him another. But this isn't really a story about marriage at all. It's about what happens when a young woman realizes that death might be a mercy compared to understanding the truth. It's about the secret that lived in Thornwick Manor, the one that explained why the Duke needed young wives, why they never lasted more than 3 years, and why Eleanor Whitmore's final diary entry simply read, "I understand now. God forgive me. I finally understand. And I wish I didn't." Eleanor Whitmore had never seen a dead body before the morning of her wedding day, but there it was, floating face down in the fountain outside her bedroom window. The woman's nightgown billowed around her like a jellyfish, pale fabric against paler skin, and for a moment Eleanor thought it might be a ghost. She pressed her face against the cold glass, her breath fogging the window, and watched as 2 groundskeepers hauled the body from the water with long poles, the way you'd fish out a fallen branch. They weren't gentle about it. The body rolled as they dragged it onto the stone, and Eleanor saw the face, blue-lipped and swollen, eyes open and staring at nothing. She was young, maybe 20, maybe younger. One of the maids rushed over with a blanket, not to cover the woman with dignity, but to hide her from the windows of the manor. And Eleanor understood that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened here. She stepped back from the window, her hands shaking, and that's when she noticed her mother standing in the doorway of her bedroom. "You saw," her mother said. It wasn't a question. Eleanor nodded, unable to speak. That was Catherine, the Duke's 4th wife. She'd been missing since Tuesday. Her mother walked into the room and closed the door behind her with a soft click that sounded like a coffin lid. She was sick, Eleanor. Melancholia. It affects some women after childbirth. The doctor said she'd been wandering at night, confused. It was only a matter of time. Eleanor found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. She had a baby, stillborn. 3 weeks ago, her mother sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing the wedding dress that lay there like a ghost itself, all white silk and imported lace. It's a tragedy, but these things happen. The Duke is devastated. Of course, he's a good man, Eleanor, a godly man. He'll be a good husband to you. Eleanor wanted to ask why a good husband's 4th wife had drowned herself in a fountain on the morning his 5th wedding was supposed to take place, but the words stuck in her throat. She'd been raised not to ask such questions. Young ladies didn't question. They accepted, they obeyed, they married who their fathers chose, even if the groom was 49 years older and had already buried 4 wives before reaching the altar with you. The wedding will be postponed, of course, her mother continued, running her fingers over the dress's pearl buttons. Out of respect, perhaps a month, maybe 2, but it will happen, Eleanor. Your father has already signed the contracts. The Duke has been very generous indeed. Eleanor knew what that meant. Her father's gambling debts had been paid. The threat of debtor's prison had been lifted. Her 3 younger sisters would have proper dowries now. All it cost was Eleanor, sold like a piece of furniture to a man old enough to be her grandfather. A man whose wives kept dying in ways that everyone called tragic, but nobody called suspicious. She looked out the window again. They'd removed the body, but the fountain still ran, water splashing cheerfully as if nothing had happened, as if a woman hadn't died there less than an hour ago, as if Eleanor wasn't about to take her place. "I don't want to marry him," Eleanor whispered. Her mother's hand stopped moving on the dress. When she spoke again, her voice had gone cold. "What you want is irrelevant. You're 16 years old. You're a woman now, and women do their duty to their families. The Duke wants a young wife. He wants children, heirs. That's what you'll give him. His other wives were weak." Her mother stood abruptly, her skirts rustling like dead leaves. The first died in childbirth. The second had a weak heart. The third took a fall down the stairs, and Catherine, poor Catherine, she lost her mind. "But you're strong, Eleanor. You're practical. You won't let your imagination run away with you like those other silly girls." Eleanor turned to face her mother fully, and for the first time in her life, she saw something in her mother's eyes that terrified her more than the body in the fountain. Her mother was afraid, not for Eleanor, of something else, something she wouldn't name. "What really happened to them?" Eleanor asked. Her mother's face went blank, smooth as a doll's. "I told you what happened. Now get dressed. We're going home to make arrangements. The Duke has requested that you stay at the manor for a week before the wedding, to familiarize yourself with your new home, to meet the staff, to understand your duties. A week before. It's customary. His previous wives all did the same." Her mother walked to the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. "Eleanor, listen to me very carefully. When you come to Thornwick Manor, you will be polite. You will be obedient. You will not go into the East Wing. You will not ask questions about the previous wives. You will not speak to the Duke about anything that troubles you. You will smile, and you will accept your fate with grace, because if you don't, your father will lose everything, and your sisters will have no future at all. Do you understand?" Eleanor understood that she was being fed to something, though she didn't yet know what. She understood that her mother knew more than she was saying. She understood that in 6 weeks she would be living in a house where young women died in fountains, and nobody seemed to think it was strange. "Yes, Mother," she said. "I understand." Her mother nodded and left, closing the door behind her. Eleanor stood alone in the room with the wedding dress, watching the fountain through the window. A raven had landed on the edge of it, drinking the water where Catherine's body had floated minutes before. Eleanor thought about Catherine's open eyes, staring at nothing. She thought about how the groundskeepers had dragged her out like garbage. She thought about how in 6 weeks she would be the Duchess of Thornwick, living in a manor with an east wing that nobody entered, married to a man who had already buried 4 wives, and she realized with perfect clarity that she was going to die there. The only question was how long it would take, and whether she would drown in a fountain or find some other way to escape a marriage that everyone called blessed, but felt like a curse. The raven at the fountain lifted its head and looked directly at Eleanor's window, and she could have sworn it knew what she was thinking. It knew that she was already dead. She just hadn't stopped breathing yet. The week before Eleanor was due to arrive at Thornwick Manor, she did something her mother had explicitly forbidden. She went to the village churchyard and found the graves, all 4 of them, lined up like soldiers in the Ashford family plot, their headstones newer than the ones around them, the marble still white and unmarked by weather. The first wife, Beatrice Ashford, died 1838, aged 19. Beloved wife, taken too soon. The second, Margaret Ashford, died 1839, aged 22. In God's arms now. The third, Judith Ashford, died 1840, aged 18. Rest in peace, sweet soul. And the fourth, Catherine Ashford, died 1842, aged 20. Gone but not forgotten. Eleanor knelt in the grass between Catherine's grave and Judith's, running her fingers over the carved letters. 4 wives in 4 years, all young, all dead within 3 years of marriage. The oldest had been 22. Eleanor was 16. She would be the youngest yet. "You shouldn't be here." Eleanor startled and turned to find an old woman standing behind her. leaning heavily on a walking stick, her face creased with so many wrinkles it looked like crumpled paper. She wore black, as many old women did, but her eyes were sharp and clear, the pale grey of winter ice. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said, starting to rise. "I didn't mean to disturb." "The dead don't mind visitors," the old woman interrupted. "It's the living who get uncomfortable with questions." She moved closer, her stick tapping against the ground with each step, and peered down at the graves. "You're the new one, aren't you? The fifth?" Eleanor's stomach twisted. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't insult my intelligence, girl. Everyone in the village knows. The Whitmore daughter, sold to the Duke to pay her father's debts. It's always the same story, different girl, same ending." The old woman lowered herself onto a nearby bench with a grunt. "Sit down. I knew all four of them, you see. I was the midwife at the manor for 30 years before the Duke dismissed me. I delivered his children, buried his wives. I know things the church doesn't want spoken about." Eleanor should have walked away, should have returned home and told no one about this conversation, but she sat down beside the old woman instead, her heart hammering in her chest. "What thing?" The old woman was quiet for a long moment, staring at the graves with an expression Eleanor couldn't read. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Beatrice was my niece, beautiful girl, kind. She was so excited to marry the Duke, thought it was a fairy tale come true. A Duke choosing a merchant's daughter. Everyone said she was blessed." The old woman's hands tightened on her walking stick. "She died screaming. Childbirth, they said. But I was there. I saw what came out of her." Eleanor felt ice water run down her spine. "What do you mean?" "I mean the baby was wrong. All twisted up, not formed right. Born dead, thank God, because nothing that looked like that should have lived. But Beatrice," she looked at it and started screaming. Kept screaming until she bled out, and the whole time she was saying the same thing over and over. "He's not human. He's not human. It's not his baby. It's not his baby." The old woman's voice had gone flat, emotionless, as if she'd told this story so many times it had lost its power to hurt her. "The Duke had me removed from the room, said I was upsetting her. By the time they let me back in, she was dead, and the baby's body was gone, burned, they said, too deformed to be buried in consecrated ground." Eleanor's mouth had gone dry. "And the others?" "Margaret lasted longer, almost 2 years. No pregnancy, though Lord knows the Duke tried. She started seeing things, hearing things. Voices in the walls, she said, scratching behind the panels in the east wing. She begged the Duke to let her leave, just for a few weeks, to visit her family and clear her head. He refused, said a wife's place was with her husband. They found her at the bottom of the main staircase with her neck broken. The Duke said she'd been walking in her sleep, but Margaret's maid told me she'd seen bruises on Margaret's arms, finger-shaped bruises." The old woman paused, reaching into her pocket and pulling out a small flask. She took a long drink before continuing. "Judith was the prettiest of them all. 17 when she married him. She got pregnant within 3 months. I wasn't allowed to attend her anymore, but I heard things from the other servants. They said she stopped talking during her 6th month, just went completely silent, would sit in her room staring at the wall for hours. The Duke brought in doctors from London, but they couldn't find anything wrong with her. She went into labor 2 months early. The baby died. So did she. Blood loss, the doctors said, but the maids whispered that she'd done it to herself somehow, that she'd chosen to die rather than bring the child into the world." Eleanor felt sick. "And Catherine?" "Catherine was different. She fought, smart girl, educated." She started asking questions the other wives had been too frightened to ask, about the East Wing, about why the Duke never let anyone in there except himself, about the sounds that came from behind that locked door at night. The Duke got her pregnant quickly, I think to keep her distracted, but Catherine kept pushing, and then the baby was born dead, just like Beatrice's. But Catherine, she didn't scream like Beatrice had. She just went very quiet and very still, and 2 weeks later, she was found in the fountain." The old woman turned to look at Eleanor directly, and her eyes were full of something that looked like pity. "You want to know what I think? I think there's something wrong with the Duke. Something not right. I think whatever he is, it can't make healthy children, and I think the wives figure it out, eventually. They see something or learn something that breaks them, and then they die, whether by accident or by their own hand or by his. I don't know, but they all die. Eleanor, every single one." Eleanor wanted to laugh, to dismiss this as the ravings of a bitter old woman who'd lost her position, but she couldn't, because everything the woman said matched the fear she'd seen in her mother's eyes, the way the servants had looked at Catherine's body, the wrongness that hung over Thornwick Manor like a fog. "Why are you telling me this?" Eleanor asked. The old woman stood slowly, leaning on her "Because you're young enough that you might be smart enough to survive." The others went into it blind, thinking they were blessed to marry a duke. "But you have the look of someone who already knows something's wrong." "That's good. That might save you." She started to walk away, then stopped and looked back. "When you're at the manor, don't go into the East Wing. Don't ask what he does in there. Don't try to understand. Just smile and nod and pray that you're barren. Because if you get pregnant, you're as good as dead. And if you hear scratching in the walls at night, don't investigate. Some doors are locked for a reason." Then she was gone, disappearing between the headstones like a ghost, leaving Eleanor alone with the graves of 4 dead women who would soon be her predecessors. Eleanor looked down at Catherine's headstone again. Gone but not forgotten. Except she had been forgotten, hadn't she? Everyone had already moved on. The Duke was already preparing for his next wedding. Life at the manor continued as if Catherine had never existed, as if none of them had ever existed. Eleanor stood and brushed the grass from her skirts. She had 2 weeks before she was due to arrive at Thornwick Manor for her pre-wedding stay. 2 weeks to decide if she was going to go through with this or find some way to escape. But even as she thought it, she knew there was no escape. Her father had signed the contracts. The money had been paid. Breaking the engagement would ruin her entire family. And 16-year-old girls in 1842 didn't have many options when it came to defying their parents and the church and society itself. She was going to marry Duke Cornelius Ashford. She was going to live in Thornwick Manor. And unless she was very, very careful, she was going to die there just like the others. The only question was whether she could figure out the truth before it killed her. Eleanor arrived at Thornwick Manor on a Tuesday afternoon, when the sky was the color of old bruises and rain threatened, but never quite fell. The carriage rolled up the long gravel drive, and she got her first real look at the place that would be her home, possibly her tomb. The manor was enormous, built of dark grey stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. 3 stories tall with more windows than Eleanor could count, though she noticed immediately that many of them in the east wing were shuttered, their windows dark even in the middle of the day. The architecture was Gothic, all pointed arches and severe angles, with gargoyles leering down from the roofline like they were waiting for something to happen, waiting for her. The front door opened before the carriage had even fully stopped, and a tall, thin man in butler's livery stepped out. He was perhaps 60, with a face like a hatchet and eyes that gave nothing away. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice as dry as old paper. "Welcome to Thornwick Manor. I am Garrett, the head butler. His Grace is waiting for you in the drawing room." Eleanor stepped down from the carriage with help from a footman who wouldn't meet her eyes. None of the servants would look at her directly, she realized. They all found something else to focus on, as if looking at her was unlucky, as if she were already a ghost. The entrance hall was as oppressive as the exterior. All dark wood paneling and oil paintings of stern-faced Ashford ancestors glaring down from the walls. A massive chandelier hung from the ceiling, but even with all its candles lit, the space felt dim, cold. The air smelled of beeswax and something else, something organic and slightly sweet, that Eleanor couldn't identify. Garrett led her through a series of corridors, each one seeming darker than the last, until they reached a set of double doors. He knocked once. waited for a response Eleanor couldn't hear, then opened them. "Miss Eleanor Whitmore, Your Grace." The drawing room was the first space in the manor that felt like a living person might actually inhabit it. A fire burned in the enormous fireplace, and the walls were lined with books. But Eleanor barely noticed the room because all her attention was fixed on the man rising from a chair by the fire. Duke Cornelius Ashford was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that hadn't yet stooped with age. His hair was white, pulled back in an old-fashioned queue, and his face was surprisingly unlined for a man of 65. Handsome even in a severe way, with sharp cheekbones and a strong jaw. But it was his eyes that made Eleanor's breath catch. They were wrong. Not the color, which was an ordinary grey-blue, but something about the way they looked at her, the way they seemed to see through her skin to something underneath, the way they didn't blink enough. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice was rich and cultured, the voice of an educated man. "How lovely that you've arrived safely. Please, come sit by the fire. You must be cold from your journey." She wasn't cold. If anything, she felt too warm, feverish with fear. But she walked across the room and sat in the chair he indicated, folding her hands in her lap the way her mother had taught her. The Duke sat across from her, studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "You're younger than I expected," he said finally. "Your father said you were 16, but you look like a child still." Eleanor lifted her chin. "I assure you, Your Grace, I am quite capable of managing a household and fulfilling my duties as a wife." Something flickered across his face. Amusement? Hunger? It was gone too quickly for her to be sure. "I'm certain your mother has been very thorough in her letters about your education and accomplishments. But I wonder, Eleanor, what do you know about me? About Thornwick Manor? About what will be expected of you here?" It was a trap. She could feel it. If she claimed ignorance, she would appear foolish. If she admitted to knowing about his previous wives, she would appear presumptuous, gossipy. She chose her words carefully. "I know that you've suffered great tragedy, Your Grace, that you've lost your previous wives to various misfortunes. I know that you're seeking an heir to continue your family line, and I know that my duty will be to provide you with that heir and to manage your household to the best of my abilities." The Duke leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Diplomatically answered, "But you didn't answer my real question. What do you know about Thornwick Manor itself? About this house?" Eleanor's heart was pounding now. "I know very little, Your Grace. Only that it's been in your family for generations." 300 years, he said softly. "Built by my ancestor, the first Duke of Ashford, in 1542. He was an interesting man, the first Duke, very interested in natural philosophy, in alchemy, in the boundaries between life and death. He built this manor to very particular specifications, with rooms designed for very particular purposes, the East Wing especially. There it was, the East Wing, the place her mother had warned her never to enter, the place Catherine had asked questions about before she died." Eleanor kept her face neutral. "It sounds fascinating, Your Grace." "Does it?" He leaned forward suddenly, his eyes locked on hers. "Most women find it disturbing. The East Wing is off-limits to everyone except myself. No servants enter it. No guests are permitted. When we're married, Eleanor, that will include you. You will not enter the East Wing. You will not ask me what I do there. You will not question why the door remains locked or why certain sounds might emanate from behind it at night. Do you understand?" Eleanor's mouth had gone dry, but she forced herself to nod. "I understand, Your Grace." "Good." He sat back again, and just like that, the intensity was gone, replaced by a pleasant smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I appreciate a wife who knows how to respect boundaries. My previous wives, God rest their souls, had difficulty with that concept. They were curious. Curiosity can be a fatal flaw in a woman." The threat was barely veiled. Eleanor understood perfectly. Stay out of the East Wing or end up like the others. But understanding the threat didn't mean she understood why. What was in the East Wing that was worth killing to protect? "I'm sure we'll have a very harmonious marriage," Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I have no interest in prying into matters that don't concern me." The Duke smiled again, and this time it looked almost genuine. "Then let me explain how things will work during your stay here. You'll have the blue room on the second floor, West Wing, far from the East Wing, so you won't be disturbed by anything. Meals will be served in the small dining room at 8, 1 and 7. You're free to explore the manor and grounds, with the exception of the East Wing and the old chapel, which is currently unsafe due to structural damage. The staff will attend to your needs, but I'd prefer if you didn't become too familiar with them. Servants talk, and I value my privacy." He stood, indicating that the interview was over. "I have business to attend to this evening, so I won't join you for dinner. But tomorrow we'll take breakfast together, and I'll introduce you to some of our neighbors. They're eager to meet my new bride." Eleanor rose as well, curtsying properly. "Thank you, Your Grace. I look forward to it." Garrett appeared as if summoned, though Eleanor hadn't heard a bell. "Show Miss Whitmore to her room, Garrett, and have Mrs. Brennan prepare her a bath. She'll want to rest after her journey." Eleanor followed Garrett back through the maze of corridors, up a grand staircase, and down another hallway to a room at the far end of the West Wing. The blue room was aptly named, decorated entirely in shades of blue from the wallpaper to the bed curtains to the rug. It was beautiful, elegantly furnished, with a view of the gardens through tall windows. It was also as far from the East Wing as it was possible to be while still remaining in the main house. "Mrs. Brennan will be up shortly with your bath, Garrett's. Dinner will be sent to your room this evening. Is there anything else you require, miss?" Eleanor shook her head. "No, thank you." He bowed and left, closing the door behind him with a soft click. Eleanor waited until his footsteps had faded, then went to the window. From here she could see the fountain where Catherine had died. Someone had cleaned it thoroughly, but Eleanor could still see a dark stain on the stone edge. She turned away and began exploring her room systematically. The wardrobe, the dresser, the small writing desk in the corner, everything was new, expensive, carefully chosen, but there was something impersonal about it, as if the room had been decorated for no one in particular, as if it had been decorated many times before, for women who didn't live long enough to leave their mark. She was about to check the small bookshelf when she noticed something odd about the wall beside the fireplace. The wallpaper didn't quite match up, as if it had been replaced or repaired. Eleanor ran her fingers along the seam and felt something give slightly, her heart racing. She pressed harder, and a section of the wall swung inward with a soft click, revealing a narrow space behind it. Not a room, just a gap between the walls. But there was something inside, a book. Eleanor pulled it out carefully. It was a diary, the leather cover worn and stained. She opened it to the first page and saw a name written in elegant script. Catherine Ashford. Her hands were shaking as she turned the pages. The entries started hopeful, cheerfully. Catherine writing about her wedding, about how handsome the Duke was, how grand the manor was, how blessed she felt. But as Eleanor flipped forward, the tone changed. The handwriting became more erratic, the entries darker. "He goes to the East Wing every night. I can hear him from my room, his footsteps in the corridor, the sound of the door unlocking. Sometimes I hear other sounds, scratching, whispering, things that don't sound human. When I asked him about it, he told me never to question him again. His eyes, when he said it, they weren't the eyes of the man I married. They were something else, something cold." Eleanor kept reading, flipping faster through the pages. "I'm pregnant. I should be happy, but I'm terrified. The midwife they dismissed. I found her in the village, and she told me things about what happened to Beatrice's baby. She said it was deformed, wrong, that Beatrice died screaming about it not being human. I don't understand what that means. How could a baby not be human? What is wrong with this place?" More pages. The handwriting getting worse. Harder read. "I saw him going into the East Wing tonight, and I followed. I know I shouldn't have, but I had to know. I had to understand what he does in there. I got to the door and I could hear him talking to something, not praying, not reading aloud, but having a conversation, and something was answering him, something with a voice like grinding stone. I ran back to my room, and I've been sitting here shaking ever since. I don't know what he is. I don't think he's human. I don't think he's ever been human. The entries became sporadic after that, weeks between them. Then this. The baby was born dead. Thank God. Thank God it was born dead, because I saw it before they took it away and it was wrong. Its eyes were in the wrong place. Its fingers were too long. Its mouth opened too wide. The Duke saw me looking, and he smiled. Actually smiled, like he was proud of what he'd created. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. I think something broke in my head. I can't stop seeing it. That thing that came out of me. That thing he put inside me. The final entry was dated 3 days before Catherine died. I'm going to leave tonight. I don't care about the scandal or what it will do to my family. I'd rather be ruined than stay here another day. I've packed a bag and hidden it in the garden. When everyone is asleep, I'll take the servants' stairs down to the kitchen and out through the scullery. There's a coaching inn 5 miles from here. If I can just get there before he notices I'm gone, if I can just get away from this house, from him, from whatever he is. I know what he does now. I know why the wives die, and I know that if I stay, I'll die too, and there will be another girl after me, and another, until someone finally stops him. But I can't be that someone. I'm too frightened. I just want to live. God forgive me. I just want to survive. There were no more entries after that. 3 days later, Catherine was dead, in the fountain. Eleanor closed the diary, her hands shaking so badly, she almost dropped it. Catherine had tried to escape, and she died. Had the Duke caught her? Had he killed her? Or had she killed herself when she realized escape was impossible? Eleanor looked around the beautiful blue room, and suddenly it felt like a cell. She was trapped here for a week, and then she would be married, and then she would be expected to produce an heir, and whatever came out of her would be wrong, just like all the others. And when she saw it, when she understood what the Duke really was, she would die, just like Catherine and Judith and Margaret and Beatrice, unless she figured out the truth, unless she understood what was happening in the East Wing and what the Duke really was and how to survive it. Eleanor stood and walked to the window again. The sun was setting now, turning the sky blood red. In the distance, she could see the east wing of the manor, its windows dark and shuttered. And as she watched, a single light appeared in one of those windows. A candle or a lamp, flickering in the darkness. The Duke was in there now, doing whatever it was he did every night, talking to something that answered in a voice like grinding stone, creating things that looked like babies but weren't quite human. Eleanor made a decision. She was going to find out what was in the East Wing. She was going to understand what the Duke was, and what he wanted, and how his previous wives had died. And then she was going to figure out how to survive, because dying in a fountain or screaming herself to death in childbirth or falling downstairs was not an option. She was 16 years old, and she was going to live, even if it meant becoming something just as monstrous as whatever lived in the East Wing. Eleanor didn't sleep that first night. She lay in the enormous blue bed with its silk curtains and down pillows, staring at the ceiling, listening. The manor had sounds. Old houses always did. Her mother had told her once, settling foundations and shifting wood and mice in the walls. But these sounds were different. Around midnight she heard footsteps in the corridor outside her room. Slow, measured steps that paused outside her door for a long moment before continuing. The Duke checking on her perhaps, making sure she was where she was supposed to be. An hour later she heard the scratching, soft at first, so soft she thought she might be imagining it. A gentle scritch, scritch, scritch that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. It moved as she listened, traveling from the fireplace across to the window, then back again, as if something was pacing behind the plaster. Catherine's diary had mentioned scratching. Eleanor pulled the blankets up to her chin and tried to convince herself it was mice. Just mice. Nothing more sinister than rodents in the walls of an old house. But mice didn't scratch in patterns, didn't pause as if listening, didn't seem to respond when Eleanor shifted in bed, the scratching stopping suddenly whenever she moved, then resuming once she was still again. At 3 in the morning, she heard something else, a sound that was almost like singing, but not quite, a melody without words, rising and falling in a rhythm that made her skin crawl. It was coming from far away, muffled by distance and walls, but she knew without being told that it was coming from the east wing. The Duke was singing to something, or something was singing to him. Eleanor got out of bed and crept to her door, opening it a crack. The hallway was dark, lit only by a single candle in a wall sconce at the far end. The singing was clearer now, though still distant. She couldn't make out words, but the melody was wrong somehow. The intervals between notes were off, not quite matching any scale she'd ever learned on the pianoforte. It made her teeth ache to listen to it. She should close the door, should get back in bed and pull the blankets over her head and try to sleep. But instead she found herself stepping into the hallway, her bare feet silent on the cold floor, moving toward the sound. The corridor seemed longer in the darkness, stretching out endlessly. The portraits on the walls looked different at night, their eyes following her as she passed. 300 years of Ashfords watching her creep through their house in her nightgown, and not one of them looked friendly. She reached the end of the West Wing corridor and found herself at a junction. To the right, more hallways leading to other guest rooms and servants' quarters. To the left, a set of double doors that she knew led toward the center of the house. Straight ahead, a narrower corridor that disappeared into darkness. That was where the singing was coming from. Eleanor hesitated. The Duke had forbidden her from entering the East Wing, had told her explicitly that curiosity killed his previous wives, but he hadn't said she couldn't explore the rest of the manor. And technically she wasn't in the East Wing yet. She was just following a sound, just trying to understand her new home. She moved forward into the narrow corridor. The air here was colder, and the smell she'd noticed in the entrance hall was stronger. That sweet, organic smell that reminded her of something rotting covered in perfume. The walls here were older, the wood paneling darker and more water-stained, fewer candles, fewer paintings. This part of the manor wasn't meant to be seen by guests. The corridor turned sharply to the left, then right, then left again. Eleanor was thoroughly lost now, with no idea how to get back to her room. But the singing was louder, and she could hear something else underneath it. That voice Catherine had written about, the one that sounded like grinding stone. It was speaking, though Eleanor couldn't understand the words. They weren't English, weren't any language she recognized. They sounded old, inhuman. She turned one more corner and found herself facing a door. Not the door to the East Wing, she didn't think, but something else. It was smaller than she'd expected, made of wood so dark it was almost black, with iron bands across it and a heavy lock. Light showed beneath it, flickering candlelight, and she could hear the voices clearly now, the Duke's cultured tones and that other thing, grinding and scraping like stone on bone. "Soon," the Duke was saying. "Very soon. This one is young, strong. She'll last longer than the others." The stone voice responded, and Eleanor felt her bladder loosen with fear. She couldn't understand the words, but she understood the hunger in them, the anticipation. "I've done everything you asked," the Duke continued. "The preparations are complete. The contracts are signed. Once we're married, once I've consummated the union, she'll be bound just like the others. Then we can begin." The stone voice laughed, and it was the worst sound Eleanor had ever heard, like bones breaking, like earth swallowing corpses, like the end of everything good in the world. Eleanor turned to run, and her foot caught on a raised floorboard. She went down hard, her hands slapping against the floor with a sound that seemed deafening in the silence that followed. The voices behind the door stopped. Eleanor scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. She heard movement behind the door, footsteps, the sound of a lock turning. She ran, blind, panicked, with no idea where she was going, just away from that door and whatever was behind it. The corridor spun around her, all sharp turns and sudden stares. She took them two at a time, her nightgown catching on something and tearing, but she didn't stop. Behind her, she could hear him, the Duke. His footsteps were unhurried, steady, as if he knew she couldn't escape, as if this was a game he'd played before with other frightened girls in nightgowns running through the dark. Eleanor burst through a door and found herself in some kind of gallery, the walls lined with portraits and the floor polished marble. Moonlight streamed through tall windows, and she could see 3 different doorways leading out. She chose one at random and kept running, through a music room with a harp standing like a skeleton in the corner, through a library with books piled on every surface, through a conservatory that smelled of earth and growing things and something dead underneath. She was crying now, great gasping sobs that burned her throat. She couldn't hear the Duke anymore, but that didn't mean he wasn't there, didn't mean he wasn't right behind her. She crashed through another door and found herself back in the entrance hall. The front door was right there, massive and locked, but right there, if she could just get it open, if she could just get outside. But her hands were shaking too badly. The lock was old, complicated, and her fingers kept slipping. Eleanor, she spun around. The Duke was standing at the top of the grand staircase, looking down at her. He was wearing a dressing gown, and his white hair was loose around his shoulder. In the dim light, he looked almost inhuman himself. His eyes eyed the candlelight and reflected it back like an animal's. "You're upset," he said, his voice calm, soothing, even. "You had a nightmare. It's understandable. The first night in a strange house can be disorienting." Eleanor pressed her back against the door. I heard you talking to something. "You heard me praying," he said, descending the stairs with slow, measured steps. "I often pray at night for the souls of my departed wives, for guidance in my new marriage. The old chapel may be unsafe, but there's a small private ottery in the east wing. Surely you don't begrudge me my faith." He was at the bottom of the stairs now, moving toward her across the black and white checkered floor. Eleanor wanted to scream, but her throat had closed up. "The voice I heard wasn't human, wasn't it?" He tilted his head, studying her. "Strange what tricks darkness and fear can play on the mind. Catherine used to say the same thing. She heard voices in the walls, saw things that weren't there. The doctors called it hysteria, a weakness of the female constitution. I'd hoped you would be stronger, Eleanor, but perhaps I was wrong." He was close enough to touch now. Eleanor could smell him, cologne and tobacco, and underneath it, that same sweet rot she'd smelled in the corridors. "Please," she whispered, "let me go, let me leave. I won't tell anyone anything. I'll say I'm ill, that I need to recover. Just please let me go home." The Duke reached out and touched her face, his fingers cold against her skin. "But you are home, Eleanor. This is your home now, and tomorrow we'll have breakfast with the neighbors, and you'll smile and be charming, and no one will ever know that you spent your first night running through the manor, like a mad woman, making wild accusations about voices in the dark." His grip tightened on her chin, painful now. "You belong to me, the contracts are signed. Your father took my money, and in 6 weeks, you'll take my name and my ring, and become my wife in the eyes of God and the law. There's no escape, Eleanor. The sooner you accept that, the easier this will be." He released her and stepped back, his face settling back into that pleasant mask. "Now, let's get you back to your room. You need your rest. Tomorrow is an important day." Eleanor let him lead her back through the manor, through corridors that all looked the same in the darkness. She was numb now, beyond fear, Everything the old woman had told her was true. Everything in Catherine's diary was true. And she was trapped here with a man who talked to something inhuman in the night, who created deformed babies, whose wives all died screaming or silent or drowned. When they reached her room, the Duke opened the door and gestured for her to enter. "I'm disappointed in you, Eleanor," he said softly. "I'd hoped you would be different. Smarter, but you're just like the others, aren't you? Curious and foolish and weak. That's going to make things very difficult." He closed the door, and Eleanor heard the sound of a key turning in the lock. She was locked in, trapped in the blue room with its beautiful furnishings and its view of the fountain where Catherine died. She ran to the window, thinking she might break it, might climb out somehow. But it was 3 stories down to the gardens below. The fall would kill her. Eleanor sank to the floor, her back against the wall, and that's when she noticed something she'd missed before. Scratches on the wallpaper near the baseboard. Not random scratches. Words, carved into the plaster, beneath the paper, barely visible, but there. She crawled closer and traced them with her fingers. "Help us. Please help us. We're still here. We're still in the walls." Catherine's handwriting, or maybe Judith, or Margaret's, or Beatrice's. 4 dead women who had scratched their final messages into the walls of their prison, begging for rescue that never came. Eleanor put her head on her knees and tried not to scream. She thought about her mother's fear, about her father's gambling debts, about her 3 younger sisters who needed dowries. She thought about how she'd been sold like livestock to a man who wasn't human, to become the mother of something that wouldn't be human either, and then to die when she understood too much. The scratching in the walls started again. Scritch, scritch, scritch. But this time, Eleanor understood. It wasn't mice. It was the others. Catherine and Judith and Margaret and Beatrice. They hadn't left Thornwick Manor when they died. They were still here, still trapped in the walls, still trying to warn whoever came next, still begging for help. Eleanor pressed her hand against the wall where the scratching was loudest. "I hear you," she whispered. "I understand, and I'm going to find out what he is. I'm going to find out what's in the East Wing. I'm going to stop him." The scratching paused, then started again, but different now, not panicked, almost like approval, like the dead women in the walls were telling her yes, yes, finally, finally someone who might survive, finally someone who might end this. Eleanor got up off the floor. She couldn't escape, couldn't run. The Duke had made that clear. But she could learn, could investigate, could figure out his secrets before they killed her. She retrieved Catherine's diary from where she'd hidden it under the mattress and opened it to a blank page near the back. She found a pencil in the writing desk and began to write. "My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I arrived at Thornwick Manor on Tuesday, April 12th, 1842. If anyone finds this diary, know that what Catherine wrote was true. The Duke is not human. There is something in the East Wing. His children are born wrong, and his wives die when they learn too much. I don't know how long I have, but I'm going to find out the truth. And if I die trying, I hope whoever reads this will finish what I started." She closed the diary and hid it back in the wall panel. Then she climbed into bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the dead women scratch their warnings into the plaster, listening to the Duke's footsteps pacing the corridors, listening to the manor breathe around her like something alive and hungry. 6 weeks until the wedding. 6 weeks to solve a mystery that had killed 4 women before her. 6 weeks to figure out how to survive. The clock on the mantel chimed 4 times. Eleanor closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but all she could see was the Duke's face when he'd said she belonged to him now. All she could hear was that voice like grinding stone, laughing in the darkness. All she could smell was that sweet rot that permeated the walls. Dawn was still hours away, and Eleanor knew with perfect certainty that it was going to be a very long 6 weeks. Breakfast with the neighbors was a special kind of torture. Eleanor sat in the morning room wearing a dress that one of the maids had laid out for her, a pale yellow thing with too many ribbons, and smiled until her face ached while the Duke introduced her to people whose names she immediately forgot. There was a vicar and his wife, round and cheerful and utterly oblivious to the wrongness that saturated every corner of Thornwick Manor. There was a colonel, retired, who kept complimenting the Duke on his choice of such a young and pretty bride. There was a magistrate who spoke at length about the Duke's generosity to the village, his charitable works, his standing in the community. They all loved him, all thought he was wonderful, and not one of them seemed to remember that he'd buried 4 wives in as many years. Eleanor watched the Duke as he charmed his guests, pouring tea and offering cakes and telling amusing anecdotes about his travels on the continent. In the morning light, he looked perfectly normal, distinguished, handsome even, for a man his age. There was nothing in his demeanor that suggested he spent his nights talking to something inhuman in a locked room. Nothing that hinted at the deformed babies or the dead women scratching in the wall. He caught her eye across the table and smiled, warm and paternal, and Eleanor smiled back because she had no choice. Because locked doors and signed contracts meant she was his property now, and he could do whatever he wanted with her. "You seem tired, my dear," the vicar's wife said, leaning forward with concern. "Did you not sleep well?" Eleanor set down her teacup carefully. "The first night in a new place is always somewhat restless. I'm sure I'll adjust." "Of course you will," the Duke said smoothly. "Eleanor is very adaptable, very sensible, not prone to flights of fancy or nervous imaginings like some young women." His eyes held hers as he said it, and Eleanor understood the warning. "Don't tell them what you heard. Don't tell them you tried to run. Don't tell them anything, or there will be consequences." She nodded and took a bite of toast she didn't want, chewing mechanically while the conversation flowed around her. The wedding would be beautiful, everyone agreed. The Duke had already commissioned a new gown from London. The church was being decorated with imported flowers. There would be a feast afterward for the entire village, because the Duke was so generous, so thoughtful, so devoted to his community. Eleanor wanted to laugh, or scream, or grab the magistrate by his starched collar and tell him that the Duke locked her in her room last night after she heard him talking to a demon. But she didn't. She sat and smiled and nodded and played the role of the happy bride-to-be, because that was what 16-year-old girls in they performed. They pretended. They died quietly when the time came. After breakfast, the guests departed in a flurry of compliments and well-wishes. The Duke walked them to the door, his hand resting possessively on Eleanor's shoulder the entire time, and waved as their carriages rolled down the drive. Then he turned to her, his smile evaporating like morning mist. "Well done," he said. "You're learning. That's good. It will make everything easier." He walked back toward the stairs, then paused and looked back at her. "I have business in the village this afternoon. I'll be gone until evening. You're free to explore the manor and grounds as you wish, with the usual restrictions, of course. Miss Brennan will provide lunch. Garrett will be available if you need anything. I trust you'll use your time wisely." He left, and Eleanor stood in the entrance hall, listening to his footsteps fade, listening to the front door open and close, listening to his carriage roll away. She was alone, well, alone except for the servants, and the things in the walls, and whatever lived in the East Wing. Eleanor made a decision. She'd been careful and obedient this morning, played her role perfectly, but now the Duke was gone, and she had hours before he returned. Hours to investigate, hours to find answers. She went back to her room first, retrieving Catherine's diary and tucking it into her pocket. Then she set out through the manor with a purpose, mentally mapping the corridors as she walked. The west wing where her room was located, the central section with the entrance hall and main reception rooms, and the east wing forbidden and locked, where the Duke spent his nights. She couldn't access the east wing directly. She'd already checked every door and found them all locked or blocked, but there had to be another way. Old houses like this always had secrets. Servants' stairs and hidden passages and spaces between the walls. She just had to find them, Eleanor started in the servants' quarters on the ground floor, a maze of narrow corridors and small rooms where the staff lived and worked. The cook was busy in the kitchen, but Eleanor slipped past unnoticed, following a hallway that led toward the back of the house. She found the laundry, filled with copper tubs and drying racks, found the scullery, where a young maid was scrubbing pots, found the pantry and the wine cellar, and the cold storage. And then she found something else, a door at the end of a particularly narrow hallway, almost hidden behind a stack of empty crates. It wasn't locked. Eleanor opened it and found herself looking at a steep staircase leading down into darkness. The smell hit her immediately, that sweet rot smell, so strong here it made her gag, but underneath it, something else, something mineral and cold, like wet stone. She should go back, should close the door and forget she'd seen it. But Catherine had written about sounds in the walls, about the Duke going into the East Wing every night. If there was a passage that connected to the East Wing, this might be it. Eleanor found a candle in a wall sconce, lit it from the kitchen fire, and started down the stairs. They went deeper than she expected, below the level of the cellars, cut into the rock beneath the manor. The walls here were stone, slick with moisture, and the air was cold enough that she could see her breath. The stairs ended in a tunnel, not a natural cave, but something man-made, carved with tools. The ceiling was low enough that Eleanor had to duck her head, and the floor was uneven, littered with small stones. She followed it, her candle throwing wild shadows on the walls. The tunnel branched. Eleanor chose the path that seemed to lead toward the East Wing, toward the center of the manor. She was deep underground now, with the weight of the house pressing down above her. If she got lost down here, if her candle went out, she might never find her way back. The tunnel opened suddenly into a chamber. Eleanor stopped so fast, she nearly dropped her candle. The room was circular, perhaps 20 feet across, with a ceiling that rose to a dome above. The walls were covered in symbols, carved deep into the stone. Not words in any language Eleanor recognized. Something older, something that made her eyes hurt to look at directly. In the center of the chamber was a well, or what looked like a well, a circular opening in the floor, surrounded by a low stone wall, with darkness below so complete that Eleanor's candlelight couldn't penetrate it. And around the well, arranged in a circle, were 5 wooden chairs. 4 of them were occupied. Eleanor's scream caught in her throat. The bodies in the chairs were desiccated, mummified by the cold, dry air of the chamber. Their skin had shrunk against their bones, their mouths open in silent screams, their eye sockets empty. They were wearing nightgowns, rotted and stained, but still recognizable. Wedding nightgowns, the kind a bride might wear on her wedding night. Eleanor forced herself to move closer, her hand over her mouth. The woman in the first chair had dark hair, or what remained of it. A locket around her neck was engraved with the letter B, Beatrice. The second had red hair, a ring on her finger too tight to remove, engraved with M, Margaret. The third was blonde, a bracelet on her wrist marked with J, Judith. The fourth had brown hair and clutched something in her skeletal hands. Eleanor pried the fingers open and found a small portrait, the kind a woman might carry of her husband. Catherine's face stared out from the miniature painting, young and smiling and alive. They hadn't left Thornwick Manor. They hadn't been buried in the churchyard with proper funerals and grieving families. They were here, down in this chamber beneath the house, arranged around this well like offerings, like sacrifices. Eleanor backed away, her candle shaking so badly the flame nearly went out. The 5th chair was empty, waiting for her. That's what the Duke had meant when he said the preparations were complete. That's what he'd promised the thing with the voice like grinding stone. 5 wives, 5 sacrifices, 5 women arranged around this well to feed whatever lived at the bottom. Eleanor turned to run and found herself face to face with Mrs. Brennan. The housekeeper was holding a lamp, and her face was as expressionless as always. "You shouldn't be down here, miss. This is the old part of the house. It's not safe." Eleanor tried to push past her, but Mrs. Brennan grabbed her arm with surprising strength. "His Grace won't be pleased. He gave you very specific instructions about where you could and couldn't go." "Let me go," Eleanor gasped. "Let me go, or I'll scream. I'll tell everyone. The vicar, the magistrate, everyone in the village. I'll tell them about the bodies, about what he's doing down here." Mrs. Brennan's expression didn't change. "And who will believe you? A hysterical girl making wild accusations about a respected duke. They'll say you're mad, just like they said Catherine was mad. They'll lock you up in an asylum, and the Duke will still get what he wants in the end. It's easier if you don't fight, miss. The others who fought, they suffered more." Eleanor stared at her. "You know, you've always known." "I've served the Ashford family for 40 years, Mrs. Brennan said quietly. "I served the old Duke before this one. I was here when he made his bargain with what lives in the well. I was here when he passed that bargain to his son, and I'll be here after you're gone, preparing the next one." She pulled Eleanor toward the chamber, toward the empty chair. Eleanor fought, kicking and scratching, but Mrs. Brennan was stronger than she looked. "It won't hurt for long," the housekeeper said. "The fall is quick, and what comes after you won't feel it. Your body will be here, but you'll be gone, just like the others." Eleanor's foot connected with Mrs. Brennan's shin, and the housekeeper stumbled. It was enough. Eleanor wrenched free and ran, abandoning her candle, running blind through the tunnels in the darkness. Behind her she could hear Miss Brennan calling for help, her voice echoing off the stone. Eleanor ran with her hands on the walls, feeling her way, taking turns at random. She had no idea where she was going. No idea if she was heading back toward the manor, or deeper into the tunnels. She just ran. Her shin cracked against something hard, and she went down, crying out. She felt around in the darkness, and found stairs. Going up, she crawled up them on her hands and knees, her breath sobbing in her chest. At the top was a door, locked. Eleanor pounded on it, screaming now. "Help, someone help me, please." Footsteps on the other side. The sound of a key turning, the door opened, and Eleanor fell through into candlelight. Garrett stood over her, his hatchet face unreadable. "Please," Eleanor begged. "Please help me, Miss Brennan." She tried to. "There are bodies down there, the other wives. They're not buried. They're in a chamber around a well. Please, you have to help me." Garrett looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached down and pulled her to her feet, surprisingly gentle. "Come with me, miss, quickly." He led her through corridors Eleanor didn't recognize, moving fast, checking around each corner before proceeding. Finally, they reached a small room, barely more than a closet, filled with cleaning supplies. Garrett pushed her inside and followed, closing the door behind them. "Listen to me very carefully," he said in a low voice. "I have perhaps 5 minutes before Mrs. Brennan realizes I helped you, maybe less, so I'm only going to say this once." Eleanor nodded, still shaking. "The Duke is not human. He hasn't been human for 300 years. His ancestor, the first Duke, made a bargain with something that lives in the well beneath the house. Something old. Something that was here long before humans built on this land. It gave him immortality, wealth, power. In exchange it required sacrifices. 5 women, bound by marriage, offered to the well over the course of 5 years. Every 100 years, the debt comes due again." Garrett's voice was flat, emotionless, as if he was reciting a shopping list. "This is the Duke's 3rd cycle. He's already sacrificed 10 women. You and the 4 before you make the 5th set. Once all 5 are dead, once you're all arranged in that chamber, the bargain renews, and he gets another 100 years. But there's a catch." He leaned closer. "The sacrifices have to be willing, not willing to die, but willing to marry him. That's why he courts you, why he gets your father to sign contracts, why the church performs the ceremony. You have to enter the marriage of your own free will, even if that will is coerced. because that's what makes the sacrifice binding. Eleanor's mind was reeling. But I didn't know. None of us knew what we were agreeing to. Doesn't matter. You agreed to marry him. That's enough. Once the vows are spoken, once the marriage is consummated, you're bound. And then he can take you down to the chamber and throw you in the well, and the thing at the bottom will accept you as payment. Garrett glanced at the door. But there's still time. You haven't spoken the vows yet. You're not his wife yet. If you can get away before the wedding, the bargain is broken. He'll have to start over with someone new. And if he can't complete the set of 5 before the 100th year ends, the thing in the well will take him instead. Eleanor grabbed his arm. Then help me escape, please. You where the keys are. You can unlock the doors. You can get me out of here. Garrett shook his head slowly. I can't. I'm bound too. I made my own bargain 30 years ago. Sold myself into service in exchange for my sister's life. I can't leave the grounds, can't directly interfere with the Duke's plans. All I can do is give you information and hope you're clever enough to use it. He opened the door a crack, listening. They're searching for you. You need to get back to your room before they realize you were gone. Pretend this never happened. Act like everything is normal. And then, when you see your chance, you run. You run, and you don't look back. But how do I figure it out? Garrett said. You're smarter than the others were. Catherine almost made it. She was going to leave that night, had a bag packed and everything. But she made the mistake of trying to say goodbye to one of the maids. The maid told Mrs. Brennan, and Mrs. Brennan told the Duke. He was waiting for her when she came down the servants' stairs. She jumped in the fountain rather than let him take her back inside. He pushed Eleanor gently toward the door. Your room is 3 corridors that way, then up the main stairs. Go now, and remember you have 6 weeks until the wedding. 6 weeks to find a way out. Don't waste them. Eleanor stumbled out of the closet and ran. She didn't encounter anyone on her way back to the West Wing, didn't hear any sounds of pursuit. She made it to her room and closed the door behind her, her heart hammering. The clock on the mantel showed that only 2 hours had passed since the Duke left. It felt like days. She went to her window and looked out at the ground. Somewhere beneath her feet was that chamber, with its well and its chairs, and its 4 dead women waiting for their 5th sister. Somewhere in the East Wing was the Duke's private oratory, where he spoke to the thing that had given him immortality. And somewhere in the village was a church where in 6 weeks she was supposed to stand and promise to love, honor, and obey a man who planned to throw her down a well as a sacrifice to an ancient demon. Eleanor pressed her forehead against the cold glass. Garrett had said she needed to be clever and needed to find a way to escape before the wedding. But how? The manor was watched constantly. The servants were loyal to the Duke, or bound to him like Garrett was. She had no money, no allies, nowhere to run even if she got out. And if she tried and failed, the Duke would know, would move up the timeline, or find some other way to bind her. She couldn't afford to fail. The scratching in the walls started again. Louder this time, more urgent. Eleanor put her hand against the plaster. I know, she whispered. I know what happened to you. I know where you are, and I swear I'm going to get out of here. I'm going to survive, and then I'm going to tell everyone what he is and what he's done. And I'm going to make sure no other girl ends up in that chamber. The scratching changed pattern. 3 long scratches, 3 short, 3 long. Over and over. Eleanor frowned, trying to make sense of it. It was almost like a code, like someone trying to communicate. She grabbed a pencil and paper from the writing desk and started marking down the patterns. Long, short, long, short, short, long. It took her 20 minutes to realize what it was, Morse code. But that was impossible. Morse code wouldn't be invented for another year, unless the women in the walls weren't bound by time. Unless death had given them knowledge they hadn't possessed in life. Eleanor decoded the message slowly, her hand shaking. East Wing, 3rd floor, Portrait, room, loose, stone, behind, Mother, Mary, key. The women in the walls were helping her, telling her where to find a key. A key to what? Eleanor didn't know, but it was something. It was a chance. She just had to figure out how to get into the East Wing third floor portrait room without being caught. How to find the loose stone behind a portrait of Mary. How to use whatever key she found there. She had 6 weeks. 6 weeks to solve a puzzle that 4 dead women were trying to help her with from beyond the grave. 6 weeks to outwit a man who'd been playing this game for 300 years. 6 weeks to survive. Eleanor folded the decoded message and hid it with Catherine's diary. Then she lay down on her bed and stared at the ceiling, planning. The Duke had made a mistake. He'd underestimated her, just like he'd underestimated the others. But Eleanor was still alive, still thinking, still fighting, and she had something he didn't expect. She had help from the dead. Eleanor spent the next 3 days being the perfect bride-to-be. She smiled at meals with the Duke. She made polite conversation about the wedding plans. She spent her afternoons in the garden or the library, never venturing near the East Wing, never asking questions, never doing anything that might make him suspicious. But at night, when the manor was dark and the Duke was in his oratory talking to the thing in the well, Eleanor worked. She'd found a map of the manor in the library, hidden in a book of architectural drawings from 1542. The original plans showed things that no longer existed or had been walled off, including a servant's passage that ran the entire length of the 3rd floor, connecting all the wings. If that passage still existed, she could use it to reach the portrait room in the East Wing without being seen. On the 4th night she made her move. She waited until midnight, until she heard the Duke's footsteps pass her door on his way to the East Wing. Then she dressed in dark clothing, took a candle, and slipped out of her room. The servants' passage entrance was behind a bookshelf in the library. Eleanor had discovered it the day before while pretending to browse for reading materials. She pulled the hidden lever, and the bookshelf swung open with barely a whisper. The passage beyond was narrow, dusty, filled with cobwebs. No one had used it in years. Eleanor squeezed inside and pulled the bookshelf closed behind her. The passage was claustrophobic, barely wide enough for her shoulders. She had to walk sideways in places, her candle held out in front of her. The walls pressed in on all sides, and she could hear things moving in the darkness. Rats, probably, or worse. The passage branched several times, but Eleanor had memorized the map. Left at the first junction, straight through the second, right at the third, and then she was standing in front of a small door, no bigger than a cupboard, with light showing through the cracks around it. The portrait room. Eleanor turns her ear to the door and listened. Nothing, just the old house settling. She turned the handle slowly and pushed. The door opened into darkness. Eleanor stepped through and found herself in a long gallery, the walls lined with portraits of Ashford ancestors, stretching back centuries. Her candle threw their shadows across the floor, making them seem to move, to watch her. She moved along the wall, studying each portrait. There were dozens of them. Which one was Mother Mary? And then she saw it. Near the end of the gallery, larger than the others, a portrait of the Virgin Mary, painted in the medieval style. Her face serene and sad, her hands outstretched, but something was wrong with the painting. The colors were too dark, the expression too knowing. This wasn't a devotional image. It was something else. Eleanor ran her hands along the frame, feeling for loose stones in the wall behind it. Nothing. She tried the floor. Nothing. Then she looked at the portrait itself more carefully and saw what she'd missed. The Virgin's hands weren't empty. She was holding something. A key, patent so subtly it was almost invisible against the folds of her robe. Eleanor pressed on the painted key, and something clicked. A section of the portrait's frame swung open, revealing a hollow space behind. Inside was a real key, made of iron, black with age. Eleanor grabbed it, her heart pounding. But a key to what? She heard footsteps in the corridor outside the portrait room. Heavy footsteps. The Duke. Eleanor blew out her candle and pressed herself against the wall behind a suit of armor. The door opened, and the Duke entered, carrying a lamp. He wasn't alone. Mrs. Brennan was with him. She was in here earlier today, the housekeeper said. I saw her through the keyhole. She was studying the portraits. The Duke moved through the room slowly, his lamp casting wild shadows. Was she now? And did she find what she was looking for? I don't know, Your Grace. I couldn't see. The Duke stopped in front of the portrait of Mary. His hand went to the frame, finding the open compartment. Clever girl, he said softly. Much cleverer than the others. Catherine never got this far. She died still thinking there was a way out through the tunnels. He closed the compartment and turned to Mrs. Brennan. Double the watch. Lock her room from the outside. And move up the wedding. We do it tomorrow. Tomorrow. But Your Grace. The preparations. Tomorrow, the Duke repeated, his voice hard. Before she figures out what the key opens. Before she finds the one thing in this house that can break the bargain. We'll speak the vows at dawn in the private chapel. No guests. No ceremony. Just binding words and consummation, and then it's done. She'll be mine, and the sacrifice will be complete. They left, taking the light with them. Eleanor waited in the darkness, her hand clenched around the key so tightly it cut into her palm. Tomorrow. She had until dawn tomorrow to figure out what the key opened and how to use it to break the bargain. The women in the walls started scratching again. Frantic now, Eleanor pressed her ear to the plaster, trying to understand. The pattern was different this time, not Morse code, but something else, a rhythm, almost like directions. Left, left, right, straight, down. Eleanor memorized it and moved through the darkness, following the pattern. Left out of the portrait room, left again at a junction, right at a staircase, straight through a hallway, and down. The scratching led her to a door she'd never seen before, tucked under a staircase in a part of the manor she hadn't explored. Eleanor held up the key. Her hand was shaking. This was it. Whatever was behind this door was important enough that the Duke had hidden the key for 300 years, important enough that he was willing to rush the wedding to prevent her from finding it. She put the key in the lock. It turned smoothly, as if it had been oiled yesterday. Eleanor opened the door. The room beyond was small, more like a cell. The walls were covered in the same symbols she'd seen in the chamber, with the well. But these were different. Protective symbols, she realized, meant to keep something in, or keep something out. In the center of the room was a wooden box, about the size of a jewelry case. Eleanor approached it slowly. The box wasn't locked. She opened it and found a book inside. Not a diary this time, but something older. A grimoire, bound in leather, that looked disturbingly like human skin. Eleanor opened it to the first page and saw writing in Latin. She'd had enough education to puzzle out the meaning. The binding of the well-keeper, as performed by Cornelius Ashford, the first in the year of our Lord 1542. This was it, the original bargain, the spell that had given the first Duke immortality in exchange for sacrifices. Eleanor read further, her candle burning low. The ritual was complex, requiring specific words spoken at specific times, but there, near the end, was a section titled The Breaking. Should the summoner wish to end the bargain before its term, he must gather the 5 sacrifices willingly and cast them into the well together, offering his own life in their place. Only blood willingly given can break what blood has bought. Only love freely chosen can unmake what greed has made. Eleanor read it 3 more times to be sure she understood. The Duke needed 5 wives dead to renew the bargain. But if someone offered themselves willingly in place of all 5, if someone chose to die to save the others, it would break the spell. It would destroy the Duke and close the well forever. But the sacrifice had to be willing, had to be chosen freely. No coercion, no trickery. Someone had to walk into that well, knowing exactly what they were doing and why. Eleanor closed the book slowly. She understood now why the first 4 wives had died, why they'd been arranged in chairs around the well, but not thrown in. The Duke had been trying to make them willing, trying to break them psychologically, until they wanted to die, until they would climb into that well of their own accord. But none of them had been willing enough. None of them had gone into the well alive, so he'd had to kill them, and arrange their bodies, and wait for the next set of 5, wait for another 100 years to pass, so he could try again. Eleanor looked at the book in her hand. This was what the dead women had wanted her to find. This was their gift, the knowledge of how to end it. But it required her death, required her to climb down into that well and offer herself to the thing that lived there, required her to die willingly to save the other, to save future girls who would be sold to this monster. Eleanor thought about her sisters, about other 16-year-old girls who might be forced into carriages bound for Thornwick Manor, about Catherine and Judith and Margaret and Beatrice, still sitting in their chairs in the darkness. She thought about the Duke's face when he'd touched her chin, when he'd told her she belonged to him, when he'd promised to make her his wife at dawn. She made her choice. Eleanor tucked the grimoire under her arm and made her way back through the manor, not to her room, but to the servants' passages, down to the tunnels, down to the chamber with the well. She didn't need a candle. The women in the walls were guiding her, their scratching leading her through the darkness like breadcrumbs. Left here, right here, down these stairs, through this passage. The chamber was exactly as she remembered. 4 dead women in their chairs. The well in the center, dark and bottomless. The symbols on the walls. Eleanor walked to the edge of the well and looked down. She couldn't see the bottom, but she could feel it. Something ancient and hungry and patient. Something that had been waiting for 300 years. "I know what you want," Eleanor said into the darkness. "I know what the bargain requires, and I'm here to break it." She opened the grimoire and read the words of the breaking ritual. Latin phrases that tasted like ash on her tongue. Words that made the symbols on the walls glow with a faint green light. When she finished reading, the thing in the well spoke for the first time. Its voice wasn't like grinding stone. It was worse. It was every cruel word ever spoken, every scream of pain, every moment of betrayal and loss and grief given sound. "You offer yourself?" it asked, freely. Eleanor's voice didn't shake. "I offer myself freely, in place of the 5, to break what was made, to close what was opened. I give my life willingly to end this." The thing laughed. "You're a fool. You could have lived, could have run, could have saved yourself." "I could have," Eleanor agreed. "But then there would be another girl, and another, and another. This ends with me. I'm the last one." She climbed onto the wall surrounding the well. The stone was cold beneath her feet. The darkness below seemed to reach up for her. Behind her she heard a sound. The 4 dead women were moving. Beatrice and Margaret and Judith and Catherine, their mummified bodies rising from their chairs. Their empty eye sockets were full of light now. Green light, grateful light. "Thank you," they whispered in voices like wind through dead leaves. "Thank you for ending it. Thank you for being strong enough." The door to the chamber burst open. The Duke stood there, his face twisted with rage. "No, you can't. You're not bound yet. The vows haven't been spoken. You're not a willing sacrifice." Eleanor looked at him and smiled. "I'm not your sacrifice. I'm theirs." She pointed at the 4 dead women. "They guided me here. They showed me the key. They gave me the knowledge. This is their choice, as much as mine. We're all willing, all 5 of us, together." The Duke ran toward her, but he was too slow. Eleanor stepped off the edge of the well and fell. The darkness swallowed her. She fell for longer than should have been possible, the walls of the well rushing past in a blur. She could hear the thing at the bottom now, not laughing anymore but screaming. Screaming in rage and pain as the bargain broke. screaming as 300 years of borrowed life came due all at once. Eleanor hit something soft and wet at the bottom. It pulled her under, cold and thick, drowning her. But even as she died, she felt the 4 dead women with her, felt their arms around her, felt their gratitude and their love and their freedom, heard them whispering in her ear, "You saved us. You freed us. You were stronger than we were. Thank you, thank you, thank you." Above, in the chamber, the Duke was aging, 300 years catching up to him in seconds. His skin withered, his bones crumbled, his screams cut off as his throat collapsed. By the time Garrett found him, there was nothing left but dust and a pile of old clothes. The well sealed itself. The symbols on the walls faded. The manor began to crumble, 300 years of unnatural preservation giving way all at once. Garrett ran, the tunnels collapsing behind him, barely making it to the surface before the entire east wing fell in on itself. He stood in the gardens, watching Thornwick Manor destroy itself, and he wept. The villagers came running, thinking there'd been an earthquake. They found Garrett standing alone, the manor reduced to rubble, and when they asked what happened, he told them the truth. Told them about the Duke and the well, and the 5 women who died to break a 300-year-old curse. Some believed him, most didn't. But it didn't matter. The Duke was dead, the well was closed, and no more young women would be sold to Thornwick Manor. They never found Eleanor's body, or the bodies of the other 4 wives. When they excavated the ruins, looking for survivors, they found the sealed well and left it alone. Some things, the workmen said, were better left buried, but sometimes, on cold nights when the wind blows from the direction of the ruins, people in the village swear they can hear women's voices, not screaming, not crying, singing, 5 voices in harmony, finally free, finally at peace. Eleanor Whitmore was 16 years old when she died, but she died on her own terms. She died to save others. She died breaking a curse that had killed 14 women before her, and in dying, she became something the Duke had never expected. She became a hero. Her father received a letter 3 weeks after Thornwick Manor fell. It was in Eleanor's handwriting, though how she'd written it no one could say. It was dated the day before the manor collapsed. "Dear Father," it read, "by the time you receive this, I'll be dead. But I want you to know that I died well. I died for a purpose. I died to save my sisters and every other girl who might have been sold the way I was. I forgive you for your debts and your weakness. I understand that you thought you were helping our family, but please, Father, learn from this. Learn that some prices are too high to pay, that some debts aren't worth the cost. I loved you. I love Mother and my sisters. Take care of them, and remember me not as a victim, but as someone who chose courage over fear, someone who looked into the darkness and jumped anyway. Your daughter, Eleanor." Her father kept that letter until the day he died. He never gambled again. He made sure Eleanor's sisters married for love, not money. And he told her story to anyone who would listen, making sure that people remembered what she'd done. In 1987, when they found Catherine's diary during the restoration, they found Eleanor's additions, her final entries, her plan, her choice. They found the grimoire too, still in its protective box, with Eleanor's fingerprints on the pages. They found evidence of 4 bodies that had been in the chamber and were gone, and they found at the bottom of the sealed well 5 sets of women's bones, intertwined as if they'd died holding each other. The archaeologists who made that discovery said something strange happened as they documented the remains. They said they heard singing, 5 women's voices, harmonizing in the darkness. And they said the bones seemed to glow for just a moment, green light like hope, like freedom, like love, freely given to break what greed had made. Eleanor Whitmore died at 16, but her story lived on, a reminder that sometimes the strongest people are the ones who choose to sacrifice themselves for others. That courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to jump into the well anyway. That darkness can be defeated, curses can be broken, and love, freely given, is stronger than any evil. She was forced into marriage with a 65-year-old duke. The secret lived buried for years, but in the end, Eleanor made sure it was uncovered, made sure no one else would die the way she did, made sure her death meant something, and somewhere in the ruins of Thornwick Manor, 5 women's voices still sing on cold nights, still celebrate their freedom, still thank the girl who was brave enough to be their last, their fifth, their salvation.